There is a specific kind of heat that rises in someone's face when they realize, mid conversation, mid conflict, mid ordinary interaction, that they are the one behaving like a child while the person across from them remains steady, measured, and completely unshaken. That heat is not anger, though it often disguises itself as anger. It is embarrassment, raw and uncomfortable. The kind that comes from watching yourself lose composure while someone else simply does not. If you have ever walked away from an interaction feeling strangely calm, only to notice days later a shift in how defensive or irritable they suddenly became around you, this is exactly what happened. And understanding it fully is going to change how you interpret every future interaction with someone who has spent this entire relationship assuming they held the emotional upper hand. Let's begin with a foundational truth that rarely gets stated directly. Maturity, in the context of relationships, is not measured by age, intelligence, or even by general life competence. It is measured by a very specific capacity: the capacity to tolerate discomfort without immediately discharging that discomfort onto someone else. This capacity is precisely what avoidant patterns often struggle with most significantly. Not because avoidant individuals lack general maturity in other areas of life, but because emotional closeness specifically activates a threat response that bypasses their usual capacity for measured behavior entirely. This means someone can appear entirely competent, composed, even impressive in professional or social settings, while still behaving with startling immaturity the moment genuine emotional vulnerability enters the picture. Let's talk about what this immaturity actually looks like in practice, because it rarely resembles obvious tantrums or dramatic outbursts. It looks like sudden, unexplained coldness that arrives without any proportional trigger. It looks like sulking disguised as needing space, silence that punishes rather than genuinely protects anyone's well-being. It looks like deflecting valid concerns by turning attention toward your reaction rather than addressing the original issue at all, a classic maneuver that shifts responsibility away from the actual behavior in question. It looks like abrupt withdrawal the moment a conversation requires sustained emotional presence, an inability to simply stay in the room, literally or figuratively, when things become uncomfortable rather than convenient. Here is what makes this particularly interesting to examine, and worth sitting with carefully. When you respond to this immaturity with your own steadiness, when you remain calm rather than matching their emotional volatility, when you continue speaking clearly and reasonably, even as they become increasingly reactive, something happens that they rarely anticipate and almost never consciously acknowledge. Your composure becomes a mirror, reflecting their behavior back with uncomfortable clarity. Without your own escalation to distract from what is actually occurring, their reaction stands entirely alone, visible, disproportionate, and impossible to reframe as a reasonable response to your supposedly unreasonable behavior. Let's talk about why this mirror effect feels so uniquely uncomfortable for someone with avoidant patterns specifically. Many avoidant individuals maintain a carefully constructed self-image built around competence, independence, and emotional control. This self-image often forms precisely because vulnerability felt dangerous earlier in life, making composure and control feel like essential armor rather than simply personality traits. When their behavior suddenly reveals itself as immature, reactive, or emotionally unregulated, particularly in contrast to someone remaining genuinely composed beside them, this threatens the very self-image their entire psychological defense system was built to protect. This is precisely why embarrassment, rather than simply annoyance, often becomes the dominant emotion in these moments, because what gets threatened is not merely the immediate interaction, but their broader sense of themselves as someone who remains in control at all times. Let's talk about the specific psychological mechanism at play here, because understanding it fully removes much of the mystery surrounding why this particular dynamic produces such intense discomfort. Psychologists sometimes describe a concept called ego-dystonic behavior, referring to actions that conflict sharply with how someone consciously views themselves. For someone who prides themselves on independence, on being the reasonable one, on maintaining emotional distance as evidence of strength rather than fear, behaving in a visibly immature, reactive manner creates significant internal dissonance. This dissonance does not simply disappear once the interaction ends. It often produces exactly the kind of embarrassment and subsequent defensiveness you may have noticed developing after these moments. A delayed reaction to having witnessed themselves behave in a way their conscious self-image cannot easily reconcile. Let's talk about what happens specifically in the aftermath of these moments, because the pattern here deserves careful attention. Often, rather than acknowledging what occurred directly, someone experiencing this kind of ego-dystonic embarrassment will unconsciously seek to restore their preferred self-image through indirect means. This might look like increased criticism directed toward you, an attempt to shift the narrative so that your composure gets reframed as coldness or manipulation rather than simple maturity. It might look like minimizing what happened entirely, acting as though the interaction was insignificant or that your memory of events is somehow exaggerated. It might look like temporary withdrawal, distance created specifically to avoid facing the discomfort of having been the visibly immature one in an interaction where composure would have been expected, and perhaps even assumed to belong to them instead. Let's talk about validation here, because this deserves to be said plainly and without hesitation. If you have noticed yourself remaining calm during moments that would have once destabilized you completely, and if you have simultaneously noticed increased defensiveness or irritability directed toward you following those calm moments, trust what you are observing. This pattern is not a coincidence, and it is not evidence that your calmness somehow provoked unnecessary conflict. It is evidence that your growth has created a contrast too significant to ignore, a contrast that reveals something they would likely prefer remain hidden, even from themselves. Let's talk about the specific origins of this defensive pattern, because understanding where it comes from helps clarify why it persists so consistently across different situations and different relationships for many avoidant individuals. Emotional immaturity around vulnerability rarely develops randomly. It typically forms during earlier developmental periods, where emotional expression received inadequate modeling, insufficient validation, or direct punishment. A child who never learned healthy ways to process disappointment, frustration, or fear within close relationships often grows into an adult who defaults to the same limited emotional toolkit whenever similar feelings arise, regardless of how sophisticated that same person might appear in every other area of their life. This means the immaturity you have witnessed is rarely a reflection of overall character deficiency. It is a reflection of a very specific, narrow gap in emotional development, one that remains largely unaddressed, precisely because avoidant patterns actively avoid the kind of sustained emotional engagement that would be required to develop those missing skills. Let's talk about what makes your own composure so significant within this specific context, beyond simply serving as an uncomfortable mirror for their behavior. Your steadiness represents something they may never have witnessed modeled clearly before: the possibility that emotional discomfort can be tolerated without immediate discharge, that vulnerability can be present within a conversation without triggering complete collapse into reactivity. This modeling, whether or not they ever consciously acknowledge learning from it, plants something significant, an example of emotional regulation that contradicts whatever limited toolkit they developed earlier in life. Whether they choose to learn from this example remains entirely up to them, but the example itself, provided simply through your own consistent composure, represents something genuinely valuable, regardless of how it gets received. Let's talk about what it costs you specifically to maintain this composure during moments that would understandably tempt anyone toward matching reactivity with reactivity. This cost deserves acknowledgement, rather than being glossed over as though composure comes effortlessly once achieved. Remaining calm while someone else becomes increasingly reactive requires genuine emotional regulation skill that likely took considerable time and effort to develop, particularly if earlier relationships or earlier stages of this specific relationship involved far less composure on your part. This effort deserves recognition as a genuine accomplishment, not simply a passive personality trait you happen to possess without any active development required. Let's talk about the specific discomfort of being blamed for their own immaturity, because this blame shifting deserves direct examination given how frequently it occurs within these dynamics. When someone's reactive behavior gets exposed through contrast with your composure, a common defensive maneuver involves reframing your calmness itself as the actual problem, suggesting you are cold, unfeeling, manipulative, or somehow strategically calm in order to make them look bad by comparison. This reframing deserves recognition for exactly what it is: an attempt to avoid facing uncomfortable self examination by relocating the source of discomfort onto you instead. Your composure did not create their reactivity. It simply removed the usual cover that mutual escalation would have provided, cover that previously allowed their reactivity to blend into a chaotic exchange, rather than standing alone, clearly visible, and clearly disproportionate. Let's talk about what genuine accountability from them would actually look like in response to recognizing their own immaturity, because this offers a useful contrast to the defensive patterns described above. Genuine accountability would involve acknowledging, at least internally, if not always explicitly, that their reaction exceeded what the situation actually warranted. It would involve curiosity about why certain topics or moments trigger such disproportionate responses, rather than immediate deflection toward blaming external circumstances or other people. It would involve, over time, visible effort toward developing better emotional regulation skills, effort that becomes evident through gradually reduced reactivity, rather than remaining a one-time acknowledgement never followed by actual behavioral change. Let's talk about what happens when this accountability never develops, because this outcome deserves honest acknowledgement, rather than being avoided simply because it feels less hopeful than the alternative. Some people, despite repeated opportunities to notice the contrast between their own reactivity and your composure, never develop the self-awareness required to address this pattern meaningfully. In these situations, the pattern simply continues, cycle after cycle, with your composure consistently exposing their immaturity, followed by their defensive attempt to relocate blame, followed by temporary distance, followed eventually by some reconciliation that resets the entire cycle without any genuine resolution ever occurring. Recognizing this cyclical pattern for what it is protects you from continuing to hope that the next cycle will finally produce the accountability that previous cycles consistently failed to generate. Let's talk about the specific relief available once you stop needing them to consciously recognize their own immaturity in order to feel validated in your own perception. Their recognition, while it might feel satisfying if it ever arrives, was never actually necessary for your perception to be accurate. You already know what you witnessed. You already understand the disproportion between the situation and their reaction to it. Their potential future recognition, or continued lack of recognition, does not change what already happened or what it revealed. This independence from needing their acknowledgement represents a significant form of psychological freedom, one that allows you to trust your own observations fully, regardless of whether those observations ever receive external confirmation from the very person whose behavior prompted them. Let's talk about the specific way this dynamic tends to affect your own confidence over time, because witnessing repeated contrast between your composure and their reactivity often produces a quiet, accumulating sense of your own capability that extends well beyond this specific relationship. Each time you remain steady during a moment that would have previously destabilized you, evidence accumulates. Evidence that you possess genuine emotional maturity. Evidence that your earlier anxious or reactive patterns, if they existed, have been genuinely transformed through deliberate effort. This accumulating confidence becomes a resource available to you in every future relationship, professional interaction, and personal challenge, entirely separate from whether this specific person ever acknowledges the transformation they have witnessed happening right in front of them. Let's talk about what it means to hold compassion for their underlying struggle, while still maintaining complete clarity about the impact of their immature behavior on you specifically. These two positions are not contradictory, despite how they might initially seem to conflict. You can genuinely understand that their reactivity stems from earlier wounds, from inadequate emotional modeling, from genuine difficulty tolerating vulnerability that has nothing to do with malice toward you specifically. At the same time, you can maintain complete clarity that this understanding does not obligate you to continue absorbing the impact of behavior that remains, regardless of its origins, genuinely immature and genuinely difficult to build a healthy relationship around. Compassion for origins and boundaries around impact can coexist entirely without contradiction. Let's talk about the specific quality of embarrassment they experience, because embarrassment here deserves distinction from shame, even though these two experiences often get confused with one another. Embarrassment tends to be situational, tied to a specific moment or specific behavior that felt exposing. Shame tends to be more pervasive, extending into a broader sense of fundamental inadequacy as a person. The embarrassment being described throughout this discussion is typically situational rather than pervasive, which explains why it often produces defensive reaction rather than genuine reflection. Pervasive shame sometimes motivates deeper change, while situational embarrassment more frequently motivates simple avoidance of whatever specific situation produced the uncomfortable exposure in the first place, explaining the withdrawal and defensiveness that so often follows these moments, rather than genuine self-examination. Let's talk about what your own healing requires moving forward, separate entirely from whether they ever address their own patterns meaningfully. Your healing requires continuing to trust your own perception, continuing to maintain composure, not as a strategy for exposing their behavior, but simply as an authentic expression of the emotional regulation you have genuinely developed. It requires releasing any lingering need for them to explicitly acknowledge what their reactivity revealed, trusting instead that your own clear understanding of what occurred remains sufficient, regardless of external confirmation. It requires continuing to hold appropriate boundaries around how much of their unaddressed immaturity you remain willing to absorb, regardless of how much compassion you might genuinely feel toward the earlier wounds that likely produced this pattern in the first place. And so, if you recognize yourself in any part of what has been described here, if you have noticed your own steadiness creating an uncomfortable contrast that seems to provoke defensiveness rather than genuine reflection, I want you to trust exactly what you are seeing. You did not create their embarrassment through cruelty or manipulation. You simply stopped matching their reactivity, and in doing so, revealed something they had spent considerable effort keeping hidden, from you and quite possibly from themselves as well. Their discomfort with this revelation is not your responsibility to manage or soften. It is simply the natural consequence of growth that has made you increasingly difficult to destabilize, growth that they never anticipated, and growth that, whether or not they ever acknowledge it directly, has already changed the entire balance of this dynamic permanently. Let's talk about a specific scene that plays out repeatedly across relationships like this, worth describing carefully because recognizing its structure removes much of its power to confuse you. A minor disagreement arises, something objectively small, a scheduling conflict, a misunderstood comment, an ordinary friction point that most adults navigate without significant incident. But instead of measured discussion, something shifts abruptly. Tone sharpens, defensiveness spikes, and suddenly the conversation has escalated far beyond what the original topic ever warranted. If you remain steady throughout this escalation, neither retreating nor matching the intensity, something becomes visible that would otherwise remain obscured: the enormous gap between the size of the trigger and the size of the reaction it produced. This gap is precisely what reveals immaturity, not the presence of frustration itself, which is entirely human and understandable, but the wild disproportion between stimulus and response. Let's talk about why this disproportion specifically indicates underdeveloped emotional regulation, rather than simply strong feelings or passionate personality. Mature emotional expression typically scales with its trigger, larger triggers producing larger reactions, smaller triggers producing smaller reactions, roughly proportional to the actual significance of whatever occurred. Immature emotional expression often bypasses this scaling entirely, producing intense reactions, regardless of how minor the actual trigger happens to be, because the reaction is not really about the immediate situation at all. It is about older, unprocessed material getting activated by something that merely resembles, even superficially, whatever originally caused significant hurt much earlier in life. This is why the same person can handle major professional setbacks with impressive composure while completely unraveling over what appears from the outside to be an extremely minor relational friction point. Let's talk about what happens specifically to your own perception once you begin noticing this pattern clearly and consistently across multiple interactions. Early on, you might have questioned yourself extensively after each disproportionate reaction, wondering what you did to cause such an intense response, searching for some explanation that would make the reaction feel proportional and therefore comprehensible. Over time, as the pattern repeats across different contexts and different specific triggers, this self questioning gradually gives way to clearer recognition, and understanding that the disproportion itself is the pattern, regardless of which specific topic happens to trigger it on any given occasion. This shift from self questioning toward pattern recognition represents significant psychological growth, protecting you from continuing to search for explanations that were never actually available because the reaction was never really about you or your behavior in the first place. Let's talk about the specific discomfort of watching someone deflect responsibility through counter-accusation, because this particular defensive maneuver deserves careful examination given how frequently it appears within these dynamics. Rather than acknowledging disproportionate reactivity, a common pattern involves immediately shifting focus towards something you supposedly did wrong, manufacturing a grievance in the moment that serves primarily to redirect attention away from their own behavior. This maneuver can feel remarkably disorienting in real time, especially if you have any tendency toward self-doubt or toward taking responsibility for conflict, even when that responsibility does not genuinely belong to you. Recognizing this deflection as a specific, identifiable pattern, rather than engaging seriously with whatever manufactured grievance gets presented in the moment, protects you from being pulled into unnecessary self-examination that the actual situation does not warrant. Let's talk about the specific exhaustion that accompanies repeatedly witnessing this pattern without it ever genuinely resolving, because this exhaustion deserves direct acknowledgement rather than being minimized. There is a particular kind of fatigue that develops from continuously absorbing disproportionate reactivity, continuously navigating deflection and counteraccusation, continuously maintaining your own composure while someone else repeatedly fails to develop equivalent emotional regulation despite ample opportunity, and quite possibly direct communication about the impact their behavior creates. This exhaustion is not a sign that you are somehow failing to handle the situation correctly. It is simply the natural, predictable cost of remaining within a dynamic where one person consistently carries more emotional regulation than the relationship as a whole requires from both people equally. Let's talk about what this exhaustion eventually teaches you about your own limits, because limits deserve honest examination, rather than being treated as something to push through indefinitely, regardless of cost. There is a meaningful difference between healthy patience, which allows reasonable time for someone to develop and demonstrate genuine change, and unsustainable tolerance, which continues indefinitely, despite clear, repeated evidence that meaningful change is not actually occurring. Recognizing where your own limit exists and honoring that limit, even when doing so feels difficult or disappointing, represents an important skill that develops specifically through the kind of repeated exposure to disproportionate reactivity being described throughout this discussion. Let's talk about the specific way children internalize emotional regulation, or fail to, because understanding early development clarifies why this pattern persists so stubbornly into adulthood for many avoidant individuals. Children typically learn emotional regulation through repeated experiences of having their difficult emotions witnessed calmly by a caregiver, gradually internalizing the message that big feelings can be tolerated without producing catastrophe, that vulnerability can be expressed without triggering rejection or punishment. When this modeling was inconsistent, inadequate, or entirely absent during childhood, Adults often reach emotional maturity in every other domain while remaining stuck, specifically around close relational vulnerability, at a developmental stage far earlier than their chronological age would suggest. This explains the strange contrast so many people notice: someone entirely capable and composed professionally, while behaving with startling immaturity the moment genuine relational vulnerability enters the picture. Let's talk about whether this developmental gap can actually close in adulthood, because this question deserves honest, nuanced consideration, rather than either false optimism or premature pessimism. Developmental gaps of this kind absolutely can close, but doing so typically requires deliberate, sustained effort, often including professional support, willingness to sit with genuine discomfort rather than avoiding it through familiar defensive patterns, and considerable patience with the slow, non-linear nature of this kind of internal growth. This closing does not happen automatically, simply through the passage of time, nor does it happen simply because someone witnesses contrast with your own composure repeatedly. It requires active, intentional participation from the person carrying the gap, participation that remains entirely their choice to make or decline. Let's talk about what remains within your control throughout this entire situation, regardless of whether they ever choose to pursue that deliberate developmental work. You control your own continued composure, developed through your own effort and deserving of your own recognition, regardless of how it gets received. You control how much continued exposure to disproportionate reactivity you remain willing to accept, and for how long, before deciding that your own well being requires different boundaries or different levels of continued investment. You control whether you continue extending patience based on genuine evidence of change, or whether patience has quietly transformed into indefinite tolerance of a pattern that shows no signs of meaningfully shifting despite considerable time already having passed. Let's talk about the specific way this dynamic tends to unfold across time if it continues without meaningful change, because the trajectory here often follows a recognizable arc worth naming clearly. Early cycles of disproportionate reactivity, followed by your steady composure, often produce genuine surprise on their part, an unfamiliar experience of not being met with matching escalation. Middle cycles often produce increasing defensiveness, as the novelty of your composure wears off and gets replaced instead by growing discomfort at the contrast it continues to reveal. Later cycles, if the pattern continues without genuine internal work on their part, often produce either resigned acceptance, a kind of grudging adjustment to your steadiness without any accompanying personal growth, or escalating attempts to provoke a reaction, testing whether sufficient pressure might eventually crack the composure that has proven so difficult to destabilize through ordinary means. Let's talk about what this final testing phase specifically looks like, because recognizing it clearly protects you from being caught off guard if it emerges within your own situation. This testing often involves increasingly personal or pointed comments, an escalation beyond whatever the original disagreement actually concerned, sometimes venturing into territory clearly designed to provoke rather than to communicate anything genuinely relevant to the situation at hand. This escalation deserves recognition as exactly what it is: a kind of desperate attempt to restore a familiar dynamic, where mutual reactivity obscures individual accountability, rather than genuine communication about anything substantive. Recognizing this pattern allows you to remain steady through even more intense provocation than you may have previously encountered, understanding that increased intensity often signals increased desperation to regain a familiar equilibrium, not increased legitimacy of whatever point is ostensibly being made. Let's talk about the specific danger of interpreting your own composure as something you need to apologize for or soften in response to their escalating discomfort. There can be a strong pull, particularly for people accustomed to managing other people's emotional states, to feel responsible for their embarrassment, to feel guilty for having somehow caused this discomfort through your own growth and stability. This guilt deserves direct challenge. You did not cause their immaturity. You simply stopped absorbing it silently or matching it with your own reactivity. Their discomfort with witnessing their own behavior clearly is not evidence that you did something wrong. It is evidence that clarity itself can feel threatening to anyone whose self image depends on avoiding that particular clarity. Let's talk about what happens to your own relationship with conflict more broadly, once this pattern of maintaining composure during disproportionate reactivity has been practiced repeatedly over time. Conflict itself often stops feeling as threatening as it once did, because you have direct, repeated evidence that you can remain grounded, even during someone else's significant emotional escalation. This changed relationship with conflict extends valuable benefit into every future relationship and interaction, professional and personal alike, providing a foundation of confidence that conflict, even intense conflict, does not require you to lose yourself or match whatever intensity gets directed toward you. Let's talk about the specific quality of self respect that develops through this repeated practice of composed response to disproportionate reactivity. This self respect differs meaningfully from confidence built through external achievement or validation. It develops instead through direct, embodied experience, proof gathered through your own actions rather than through anyone else's assessment of your worth. Each time you remain steady during a moment that would have previously destabilized you, you gathered additional evidence supporting a growing internal narrative, one that says clearly, I am capable of remaining myself, even when someone else cannot remain composed alongside me. This narrative, built slowly through repeated experience, becomes remarkably resilient, difficult to shake regardless of what future challenges eventually arise. Let's talk about what it means to eventually release any lingering hope that this specific person will fully recognize and appreciate the growth you have demonstrated throughout this entire process. This release does not require bitterness or resignation. It simply requires honest acknowledgement that their recognition was never actually necessary for your growth to be genuine or valuable. Whether they ever consciously articulate appreciation for your composure, whether they ever acknowledge their own immaturity directly, whether they ever pursue the developmental work required to close their own emotional regulation gap, none of this determines whether your own transformation was real and worthwhile. It simply happened, independent of their response to it, and it remains yours regardless of how the broader situation eventually resolves.